For the first time in history, 5 Level 1 crises threaten to detonate simultaneously. Taiwan, Ukraine, Iran, North Korea, and a global cyber collapse. The Council on Foreign Relations calls this, frankly, unprecedented. But here's what they're not telling you. These crises aren't isolated incidents. They're dominoes, strategically positioned. And when one falls, the world as we know it could end in 2025. Global defense spending has hit record levels. NATO is testing the limits of its capacity. And for the first time since the Cold War, multiple nuclear powers are in direct confrontation. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The post-1945 world order isn't just fraying at the edges, it's actively disintegrating. And the resulting power vacuum? Revisionist states are racing to fill it. I'm James Whitfield from FAULTLINE Economics. While others chase headlines, we examine the systems that actually shape history, geography, demographics, and economic fundamentals. Today, we're analyzing the 5 flashpoints that could trigger World War III in 2025. This is strategic clarity in a complex world. Let's turn to the strategic map. The world of 2025 exists in a state of crisis contagion. It's not just about multiple potential conflicts. It's about the systemic failure of traditional deterrence and diplomacy mechanisms. The erosion of norms in one conflict, say Ukraine, lowers the barrier for aggression in another, like the Taiwan Strait. Economic warfare through tariffs and sanctions creates the fragile conditions for military conflict. And a systemic shock, a cyber attack, could be the catalyst that ignites multiple flashpoints simultaneously. The data doesn't lie. In previous years, the Preventive Priorities Survey typically identified 1 or 2 top-tier threats. In 2025, 5. This quantitative jump implies a qualitative shift. We're not dealing with more problems. We're dealing with a collapse of the system designed to manage them. Factor 1. The Eastern Front, Ukraine and the NATO-Russia standoff. Russia now controls approximately 19% of Ukrainian territory. But beyond the headlines, there are systems. Russian forces are advancing at their fastest pace in a year, having recently entered Pokrovsk. The human cost? Staggering. Russia, 790,000 casualties. Ukraine, 400,000. But here's the deciding factor. Russia has shifted to a salvo war strategy, launching attacks with up to 300 drones and missiles per wave, up from 100 in 2022. The intervals between attacks collapsed from 1 month to just 2 days. Let me show you exactly what I mean. The RAND Corporation identifies 3 pathways to direct NATO-Russia conflict. Path 1. Russia launches a preemptive strike, believing NATO intervention is imminent. Path 2. Russia targets NATO logistics centers in Poland or Romania. Path 3. A Russian attack accidentally kills NATO officials, triggering Article 5. This changes the entire equation. Russia's economy is projected to grow just 0.9% in 2025. The governor of Russia's central bank stated their wartime resources are truly exhausted. Time is running out for Moscow. Factor 2. The Pacific Powder Keg, Taiwan's Silicon Shield. Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. These chips are the oil of the 21st century. A blockade alone could risk $2 trillion in annual economic activity. The military balance? China now has the world's largest navy by ship count. But Taiwan has adopted a porcupine strategy. Thousands of small, mobile, lethal systems designed to make invasion prohibitively costly. A CSIS wargame run 24 times concluded that a US-Taiwan-Japan coalition could defeat a Chinese invasion. The cost? Catastrophic. The US would lose dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of personnel. Taiwan's economy would be devastated. But all of this hinges on one deciding factor: Japan. The US cannot effectively defend Taiwan without Japanese bases and support. And Beijing knows this. Xi Jinping has instructed the PLA to be ready to invade by 2027. Factor 3. The Middle East Inferno, Iran's nuclear gambit. The 12 Days War of June 2025 marked a fundamental shift. Israel's preemptive Operation Ascending Lion targeted Iran's nuclear facilities, missile sites, and military leadership. The US joined with its own strikes on days 21 and 22. Here's what they won't tell you. The attacks may have been a strategic blunder. By breaking the ambiguity of the shadow war, Israel and the US demonstrated to Tehran that conventional forces and proxy networks are insufficient deterrents. The only true deterrent, a nuclear weapon. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical oil choke point. Disruption here would have immediate and severe global repercussions. The Houthis have already cut Suez Canal traffic drastically. Add Hormuz to the equation, and you have a global energy crisis. Factor 4. The Korean Peninsula, a crisis of miscalculation. North Korea has expanded uranium enrichment, developed new missile platforms, and conducted tactical nuclear exercises. But here's the strategic shift. The collapse of UN sanctions consensus has emboldened Pyongyang. Russia's veto in March 2024 ended UN sanctions monitoring. North Korea is now a key military supplier for Russia's war in Ukraine, reversing the patron-client dynamic. This new alignment provides diplomatic cover, economic resources, and military validation. The conventional threat remains sole, thousands of artillery systems within range. Even degraded, a realistic scenario projects 2,600 civilian fatalities in the initial barrage. That's catastrophic leverage. Factor 5. The systemic shock, cyber Armageddon. NATO recognizes cyberspace as an operational domain. Nearly 60% of organizations say geopolitics influences their cyber strategy. But the real threat isn't data theft or ransomware against a single company. It's a coordinated systemic shock attack, financial system disruption, power grid deactivation, and simultaneous disinformation campaigns. China's Volt Typhoon has pre-positioned malware across US critical infrastructure. Russia's APT-28 combines cyber operations with physical sabotage. The data doesn't lie. Cybercrime is projected to cost $10.5 trillion annually by 2025. A single extreme event could reach $2.5 trillion in losses. But all of this hinges on one deciding factor: crisis contagion. The danger isn't a single war. It's that the international community's capacity to manage one conflict gets overwhelmed by another erupting. US preoccupation with Taiwan could be perceived by Russia as an opportunity window in Europe. An economic shock from tariffs or cyber attack could lower the threshold for conflict everywhere. This isn't just multiple problems. It's the collapse of our ability to manage them. Now, let's connect the dots. What do you think is the most critical flashpoint that could trigger a cascade effect? Drop your analysis in the comments. I read every strategic insight you share. The implications run deeper. Each crisis influences the others. A semiconductor shortage from Taiwan conflict cripples defense production globally. Energy crisis from Middle East conflict weakens European resolve on Ukraine. Cyber attacks degrade command systems precisely when they're needed most. Multiple nuclear powers in simultaneous confrontation for first time since Cuban Missile Crisis. These aren't just regional conflicts anymore. They're interconnected nodes in a global system under unprecedented strain. And when systems under strain reach a breaking point, they don't bend, they shatter. This connects directly to our analysis of China's geographic vulnerabilities and why Taiwan represents an existential imperative for Beijing. You can find that breakdown in the card above and in the description. It reveals another piece of this strategic puzzle. So, what does this mean for the global balance of power if even two of these 5 crises erupt simultaneously? We're looking at a fundamental restructuring of the international order. The post-1945 system, UN, Bretton Woods, nuclear non-proliferation, would be effectively dead. By 2030, we could see a tripolar world. A US-led democratic bloc, a China-Russia authoritarian axis, and a non-aligned movement of states trying to navigate between them. Global trade would fragment into regional blocs. Technology would bifurcate into competing standards. And the nuclear taboo that has held since 1945, it might not survive. This is where geography becomes destiny. The states with defensible borders, energy independence, and food security will thrive. Those dependent on global supply chains and international stability, they'll struggle to survive. The future isn't written, but the blueprint is there for those who know how to read it. 5 dominoes are positioned. The question isn't if one will fall, but which one falls first, and whether we can stop the cascade. If this kind of strategic analysis helps you understand our complex world, subscribe to help us create more content like this. Because in 2025, understanding these systems isn't just academic, it might be survival. Stay strategic.